Welcome to the show. And today I am going to be speaking with a guest who has some great insight into how to make podcasting easier for you. So, if you are a podcaster, then this is going to be very interesting for you. And if you're thinking about having a podcast, and realistically, lots of coaches and speakers and business presenters are. And if that's you and you're on the verge of, should I do it? Shouldn't I do it? This episode might just help you make your decision when you see how easy it is to take some of the pain out of the workflow in having a show. So, in this episode, we're going to be talking about how to streamline your workflow if you have a podcast and how to make life easier for podcasting if you want to start one. My guest today is Joe Casabona, and I've been following Joe for some time. He gives some really good advice to podcasters on how to get great results and how to produce a quality show, as well as making the whole process smoother. Now, systems and processes are not most people's forte, certainly not mine. But when you have good ones in place, they can free up a lot of time and take away a lot of stress. And by the end of this episode, you're going to know how to have an efficient podcast. And Joe's going to share where you can go to get some additional resources to help you systemize your workflow that might be useful for more things than just podcasting. You'll also find out how we're utilizing AI in our podcast workflows. So welcome to Present Influence, the show that helps coaches, speakers, and business leaders develop the communication skills to influence and inspire. My name is John Ball, keynote coach, professional speaker, and your guide on this journey to mastery level communication and presentation skills. My mission is to provide professional communicators like you with everything you need to maximize your impact and present with influence. Follow the show on your favorite podcast app for weekly episodes and interviews with influence experts. Joe, welcome on Present Influence. I've been looking forward to speaking to you. I've been following you for a while. I think I may have mentioned this to you when we first spoke, but you are someone who's pretty well respected in the podcasting world as knowing what you do, like a systems guy. Everyone says you need to be following Joe. And I did, and you do. You put out some really good value stuff. So I'm very happy to be speaking with you today.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the kind words. I really appreciate that. I basically just try to share everything I'm doing in hopes that I save people time and pain.
You do a very good job with that. And I know your journey to podcasting wasn't necessarily the smoothest ride, and you've been making it a lot smoother for yourself. So for our listener, just a little bit about how you got into podcasting and what was going on there that led you down the path that you've now gone on.
Yeah, so I got into podcasting after I was talking to a few friends. This was like 2009, 2010. We had this thing called Hogfest where we would roast a whole pig over Labor Day weekend here in the States. But one night we were just out and we were talking, and I noticed that all my friends knew things outside of their area of expertise in a way that I didn't feel I did. And I said, "How do you know all this stuff?" And they're like, "We listen to podcasts." And I'm like, "Oh, cool." So started listening to more podcasts, and I did the thing that I think everybody does after they listen to podcasts for a while, which is they say, "I could have a podcast." I started a podcast. It went very poorly. It closed. It was like a panel podcast, or it was poorly moderated because I'm a bad moderator. But a couple years later, I actually started a proper one. And my dad, you said I had a rough go at first. Yeah, my dad says I'm a bull in a china shop. I do things. They say measure twice, cut once. I measure once and cut twice, or I cut and then measure, whatever. Ready, fire, aim is what I generally do. I say basically I've decided that anything I do on the internet is fixable largely. Posting stuff on the internet will always be posted on the internet, but as far as launching projects, I can try and iterate. And so that's essentially what I did. I just launched the podcast, so I would launch it. And then I've spent the next 12 years or so fixing all the things that I happen to find that could need improvement. And I share what I'm thinking about as I'm fixing those things.
Am I right that you're pretty much a full-time podcaster these days, yeah?
Yeah, I think that's right. I guess if we count like the consulting I do, which is mostly for podcasters, I would say yes. I have a few podcasts and I help people with their podcasts.
Yeah. And what is it realistically like being and I need to do the consulting as well, but I mean, is it possible to make a living from podcasting these days? I guess is what I want to ask.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are definitely a few ways that you can make money podcasting. I would say, in the sake of full transparency, I have not been able to have my sole income come from just my podcasts, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I do get sponsorship money from my podcasts. I get affiliate income from my podcasts. The main thing, I have a light membership, we'll say. I don't treat that as appreciable money, but it's something I'm trying. I think by and large, the best way for small independent podcasters to make money is to use the podcast to leverage their expertise and get clients. And so
Yeah.
that's always been my goal of at least one of my shows, right? Is show people, hey, I really know what I'm talking about. If you want me to help you, join my mailing list or hire me as your coach. And I think if you do that, you can definitely make a living off of, we'll say, leveraging your podcast as a marketing tool for your services.
Yeah. I definitely want to get into a bit more about what you do and how you do things because it's super interesting to me. But I want to give some basis to that for some of our listeners as well, who either maybe have a podcast and are struggling with it, or not really feeling the benefits of it, or thinking about starting one, thinking, I don't know if this is really going to be worth the time. What would your general advice be there? Do you think it's valuable for, particularly for business owners and professionals, to have some kind of podcast?
I do, because I think it's valuable for business owners and coaches to create content. And I think having a podcast can be a easy way to create multiple pieces of content, if that makes sense. So if your goal is, I want to get millions of downloads and I want to be the next Joe Rogan, or I want to be the next Conan O'Brien, or the next Talk to a Girl. Maybe I'm really time stamping this. I can't imagine that show's going to last very long, but then it's not worth it probably, right?
Yeah,
Because that's going to take a lot of time and effort, and you're going to have to get famous by going viral doing something disgusting. But if you're looking for it to support your business, absolutely, because you are creating content and you're being generous with your time and you're showing people you have an expertise in something. And no matter, as long as you have a handful of downloads and you're reaching those people and you're showing up, then that could lead to client work. And
right.
so I think that absolutely worth it if you're using a podcast to support your business.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think it can be great for positioning, and it can also be great for networking and connecting with other people. One of the things that perhaps doesn't make it so great, or does put a lot of people off, is the work side of this. Like, yeah, you can get some great content and you can repurpose it, but there can still be a lot of work that goes into the production and all that. And this is really one of the things that you have dug into and I'd say made a big splash in how you approach things, and that is now what you essentially consult people on and making this a more doable thing. So why did you start down that path yourself? And what kind of things are you generally doing to help people to simplify for their own podcast production? Big question, sorry.
Yeah. So, two things that you should know about me as we move into this is that I over engineer a lot of things. And so I love building systems. And the other thing is that whenever I see a problem, I absolutely have to solve it. It drives my wife crazy when she like wants to just talk and like vent. And I'm like, what if we did this? And she's, I don't want the solution. And I'm like, all right, understood. So I'm always looking for solutions to big problems. This solution came when I had a big problem in November 2020. I had a panic attack. My wife is a nurse. We had 2 kids at the time. We now have 3. And I was struggling because they weren't in school. Well, my son was just a few months old at that point, and I wasn't working on my business. My business was more than half of our income, and I didn't feel I was doing enough. And so I had all of this on my mind. Staying at home with your kids like 24/7 is really hard, no matter how much you love them. And I had a panic attack. And so as I'm sitting on the floor in my kitchen, like crying and rocking, my 3-year-old daughter at the time, she's my oldest, comes over and brings me a bottle of water and a towel and says, "It's okay, daddy." Everything's going to be okay. And I thought, this is not okay to me. My children shouldn't have to take care of me. And so the next day I could work, I forget what my wife's schedule worked out to that, but the next day I could work, I hired a VA and I made a list of everything I did. And I put a checkbox next to the 2 or 3 things that absolutely I had to do. And then I decided to automate or delegate everything else. And so this took some time. My VA came on and onboarded. I used tools like Zapier and make.com to automate as many processes as possible. Fast forward about a year later, December 2021, our youngest daughter, Abigail, was born on Christmas Eve. And I took an entire month off to spend with my family. And I wasn't stressed and I didn't have a panic attack because I knew over that 13 months, I put the systems in place that I needed to help my business run a little bit more on autopilot.
Mm. It's thank you for sharing. I mean, it's quite a vulnerable story, but a really powerful one that you shared there. That led ultimately to a big breakthrough for you. That you are now helping other people to have those kind of breakthroughs for themselves.
Yeah.
Why do you think people don't do more of that anyway?
I think if they're anything like me, they may not see the problem until it becomes a big problem, or they think they can muscle through it. Before that, I was like, I'm a man, I can do it, right? Like, I'm John Wayne or whatever, right? Like, men don't cry, I can do it.
Right.
But ultimately, it's probably that it's a slow pileup that you don't realize is happening, right? Going from 1 to 2 kids, for example.
Yeah.
Yes, that's hard, but quote unquote, how hard is it? And okay, it's the pandemic and I'm skipping a couple of weeks for my podcast and people understand, even though everybody during the pandemic started a podcast. People will understand. But then I start to think, oh, I really need to get this episode out. And oh, I haven't done proactive outreach for sponsors in a while. And 30 to 40% of my income came from sponsors at the time. And I really haven't locked down a client in a while because I've been off. And now I'm like, oh my God, we're about to enter Christmas and I'm not making any money. How am I supposed to support my family moving into the next year? And that's when and then the kids are crying and I'm trying to be dad, but I'm not fully focused on being. And so like things pile up and they don't see it coming. And so I want to help people never have to see it coming. I want to alleviate that stress before it becomes a problem.
Do you think that maybe sometimes there's a bit of a control element that some people have with their podcasts, or maybe even a financial concern about spending out money on getting other people to help with this?
Oh, yeah, as far as, like, why they don't actually do the thing, even though, like, people like you and I are probably telling them to do the thing. Absolutely, control is one, right? Nobody can edit the podcast like I can, or nobody's gonna gather the right show notes. I hate to break it to you, but unless you're an audio engineer, a lot of people are gonna do it better than you can. And as far as, like, gathering the show notes, like, that's as long as you're clear with your instructions, anybody can do that, right? The
Mm.
only thing that you offer that other people won't do as well as you is your perspective and your voice, which is like a hard truth, right? Nobody wants to told they're not unique. I think of it
Yeah.
in like as in it's playoff season here in the United States. For if you're a baseball fan, I love baseball. And there are 9 guys in that lineup and most of them hit pretty well. Some hit better than others, but they can all hit a major league fastball. And so the ability to hit is not the thing that makes them unique.
Right.
Their approach is what makes them unique. Aaron Judge hits home runs really well. Jazz Chisholm Jr. gets on the bases and then runs real fast. Some guys can hit it in the opposite direction and drive in runs that way. That's the unique thing that they bring to the lineup, not just the ability to do some basic thing well.
Yeah. I feel more and more the longer I've been podcasting, the more important it is to understand how there needs to be some level of uniqueness to what you bring to the podcasting world. I was recently reading a new listening to, I should say, a new audiobook from one of my favorite storytelling experts, a guy called Matthew Dix. I don't know if you've heard of Matthew, but he has some really, really good content on storytelling. And one of the things that he was saying in there is that, on stage, whatever reason you are, and we could take this as podcasting as well, we should always assume that people don't want to hear from you. So we have to
Mm,
give them a reason to want to hear from you, to hear what you have to say. And I think far too many people miss that and just think, they have a bit more of the sort of field of dreams sort of thing. If we make it, they will listen, which isn't the case, right? I mean, just isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. My friend Chris Lemma, he actually runs the conference that I just got home from. It's called Cabo Press. It's amazing. But he was giving me pointer. We both spoke at an event, and he was giving me pointers. And he said, "So you opened with who you are and what you do. No one in that room cares about you. They're there for the topic.
Right.
So plus the person just introduced you. They probably already said that stuff. What you want to do is hook them with a story." This
Yeah.
is why I started with the story I remember most him telling is one about Reggie Jackson, because again, I love baseballs. And that he was right. That story like drew me into his talk. And he didn't tell us who he was until the end, after we cared, because wow, you're really smart and you have really good insight, and I think you can help me. So spot on that advice. Like no one cares about you until you give them a reason to. So
Yeah.
give them a reason to.
We wish more people would have that approach in
Yeah.
podcasting, but it's like you said, hard lessons. These are hard lessons to learn.
Yeah. Everyone's the hero in their own story, right? And you need
Of
to
course.
realize that you might be the hero in your story, but you're not the hero in your listener's story.
Yeah. It's always fascinating to me when I work with clients. Some of them and I work with more with speakers, and some of my clients are experienced in speaking, but they're not always experienced in all the different kinds of speaking that there are. So when they're transitioning, especially from like a workshop scenario into a keynote scenario, or if they're being podcast guests or something like that, things they may not be used to doing, there's very different approaches and things that need to come into it. And you can't always see yourself clearly. So I think sometimes we do need to have an external perspective, and we do need to know, like, some self-evaluation is great, but we need more than that. We need some external input as well.
Yeah.
I'm very, very aware that a lot of people who want to do this podcasting thing will be thinking, that we come back to like the work that's involved with it. You said earlier you created a whole list of all the things that you did, and essentially passed as much of that onto a VA as you possibly could. For anyone who is like thinking, well, I have a show and struggling with it, and sometimes maybe finding it hard to get the episodes out on time or to get everything done, where would you start with someone in that sort of position? Like, what's the first thing they should really look to do?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's hard to, like you just said, it's hard to see. You need like this external influence sometimes, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to read the label from inside the bottle. If you're in the thick of it and you don't take a step back to be like, what am I even doing? Then you're never going to get out of this cycle. So the first thing you do is write everything that you do down. Make sure that you are documenting every step in your process, because only then will you have a full understanding of exactly what you're doing here. By the way, this process is something I called the PER method. So PER. The first letter P stands for perform. You actually want to perform everything that you're doing, right? Make a list of everything you're doing, perform it, write it down, document what you do,
Yeah.
right? And then ask what are the inputs and what are the outputs, because then you really understand what you're doing. Evaluate is the E in PER, and that's, do you need to do it? Can only you do it, right? Those are two different questions, but they are the answer to those two things are going to help you simplify, automate, and delegate. So do you need to do it? Is this a step I really need to take? If not, throw it out. And if it's a task that needs to be done, but other people can do it, now it's ready for automation and delegation. You're also going to ask yourself, are the inputs clear? Are the outputs clear? Can another person do it, or can a computer do it? This is all in the evaluation phase. You're figuring out, okay, how do I book guests? I email the guest I want to have and I say, hey, what times work for you? And then they're like, I'm open anytime. And then okay, what about like Wednesday at 4 p.m.? Yeah, 4 p.m. Where are you? Are you in the Eastern time zone? No, I'm in Arizona. Okay, is it November? Who knows what time it is in Arizona in November? Okay, I did that. I can probably make that easier by using a scheduler. So you're going to do this for everything that you do. This is going to take some time, but at the end, you're going to have a list of things and processes that you perform. So that's perform and evaluate. The R is remove. If you don't need to do the task, if you personally don't need to do the task, determine if a person or a computer should do it. If the inputs are the same every time and the outputs are the same every time, a computer can do it, right? So if it's, okay, a name, an email address, and a time for us to meet are the inputs and an output as a calendar invite, then okay, great. I can delegate that to cal.com or Zapier or whatever. Probably not Zapier. If they aren't clear, then like a human being probably has to do it, right? So like when I edit my podcast, it's not just do these 5 things exactly what I mean. My editor actually has to go through and edit the podcast. Then you can remove it from your list. And the last thing I'll say here before someone says, hey, but what if it's stuff I want to do? Yeah, there is some personal preference here. I can delegate the sponsorship outreach or the guest outreach, and I don't, because I feel those relationships are too important. I use Podmatch. I think that's how we got linked up, right?
Yeah.
I use Podmatch to surface things more easily, surface shows and people more easily, but I don't delegate that because, especially if I'm about to ask a sponsor for 5 figures, I want them to know that they're getting me and that I'm there to help them. I don't want some virtual assistant or some automated CRM AI bot thing reaching out to them. There is some nuance there, but what you don't want to fall into is like the Marie Kondo, everything sparks joy. So I'm going to keep everything, right?
Yeah.
There's only probably 3 or 4 things that you personally really need to do or want to do because it benefits your business.
As you speaking, one of the things that was coming up for me, I'm thinking, oh well, if I was in that position where I was sort of consulting and stuff like, we need to get all of your processes down, and it's just something I know I need to do it. The resistance that comes up straight away for me is I'm going to have to slow down. This is going to take ages to get all these systems down, even though I know it's absolutely going to be worth it. But we do really have to slow down to be able to speed up, as paradoxical as that sounds, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I heard this on Modern Family, but slow is smooth and smooth is fast is something that Phil would say, the patriarch of the,
Oh,
let's
yeah.
say, the
Watch
main
that show,
family.
yeah.
And it's absolutely true. And like I sent an email out actually just today for my newsletter called One Small Step for You. And it's, yeah, I talk about my ridiculous like Rube Goldberg machine and my dozens of automations and stuff like that. I have been automating for 8 years now. Explicitly automating for my business, I should say.
Right.
I've been automating in some way, shape, or form for 20 years because I was a programmer in a previous life. You don't need to start with something wild, right? You can start with a 2-step automation that updates a status in Notion, right? It doesn't need to be a lot. It is an incremental thing. And over time, yeah, you'll be saving a ton of time every week. But for now, I would look at what's low-hanging fruit or what's the biggest impact.
Yeah.
If you're not using a scheduling link, that is going to have just an incredible amount of impact on your process because you don't have to worry about the time zone dance or communicate. You just say, grab a time here and everything else is handled. It'll take
Right.
an hour to set up, but everything else is handled.
Yeah, I think my annual investment in Calendly has paid dividends for being able to arrange. I like to do my pre-interviews, and usually we can set up the interview time if we move ahead from there, which is for me just a nice easy way to do it. People can select their own times for the pre-interview, we make sure that happens, and then we can flow into booking the show from there. What are your thoughts on AI tools that are around right now? And again, this could 6 months time, a year's time, it could all look very different, right? But currently, there's a lot of AI tools around. I don't know, some of it's fairly new. What's your take on what's available right now?
Yeah, great question. And I've been getting this, as you can imagine, a lot more
Sure.
lately, right? I am AI hesitant, right? Because I think as we record this, we're just shy of the 2-year anniversary of ChatGPT becoming public. It
Okay.
feels weird. It feels way longer than 2
Mm,
years, but it was November 2022 that it launched. And basically from that moment, there are people who are like, "I'm an AI expert, and you can write your book in 48 hours with AI."
mhm,
And I'm like, "I hate to break it to you, but if you wanna write literally anything, yeah, sure. If you wanna write something worth reading, it's not gonna that ain't it." And the same thing goes for podcasting. People are like, "Oh, yeah, like, with AI, we can do this, or we can have it write our scripts for us." No. AI is your intern. AI is not your CMO,
yeah,
right? Or your senior content writer. AI is your intern. And so if you're a podcaster or a small business owner and you're like, "Hey, how can I leverage podcasting or leverage AI to help with my podcast?" There are a few ways. One is research, right? If you're thinking of a topic, create an outline and say to your favorite chatbot of the day, "Hey, I am thinking about doing a podcast episode on this. Here's the basic outline I came up with. By the way, my show, if you don't know, is about this. What am I missing?" Right? I always like to ask, "What am I missing?"
yeah,
Because this is what the large language model is best at. It's not good at inventing things. It invents things all the time. It's good at getting a perspective that you don't have. And it could surface 10 things and 3 of those are completely fabricated, but the 7 are okay. You're like,
yeah,
"Oh, yeah, I didn't think about that. Let me noodle on that." I've also used it to come up with, like, listener avatars, right? So it's, "My show is for this. Give me an avatar." And I swear to you, when I rebranded my podcast, it invented single mom named Jenny who was 38, who worked a job and had a podcast and wanted to spend time with her 7-year-old daughter. And I'm like, "I know this person. I know Jenny." Like, she's in my neighborhood. And so I think it's really good at that. And then
yeah,
on the other side is if you're into scripting, if that's your thing for your podcast, I think that AI is good at punching up your first draft, which I wouldn't have said probably like 3 months ago, but
mm,
now, at least with the latest version of ChatGPT I'm using, I give it something and I'm like, "Hey, how can I fix this?" And it does give me a better version now. So maybe it's finally learned how I write, or maybe because it's using what I've written, it gets me it knows where to fix, but I've had good interactions there. So I think like research, um, and like fixing, or adding to what you've written are both really good things. And then finally on the post-production AI side or on, promotion side, there are like some clip makers out there. We both use Riverside.
yeah.
It's fine. I
I
don't
don't
think it's
love it
going
for
to.
that.
Yeah. Mi Descript is maybe better for that,
Yeah,
I think, o but only because it, like, basically builds the template. It doesn't get the moment exactly right. So,
true.
I think if you're going in and thinking like, "Oh, I'll just give it my episode, and then it'll give me 10 clips I can share." It won't. Like, it'll give you 2 clips you can share and then 8 clips that you need to adjust in some way, shape, or form. And at that point, I'm like, "You know what? Like, the juice isn't worth the squeeze." I'd rather just record my own short form video talking about the episode
Yeah,
and release that.
yeah. I tend to find I love using I use a mix usually of Descript and Riverside for my show notes now,
Mhm.
and it
Yeah.
saves me so much time. And you still have to read the stuff through because there are certain times where it just says something and where it's like that is not how a person speaks, and you do have to change that. And I have seen people putting out show notes that very clearly haven't been checked for from the AI that have done it. I think it's a very good idea. It doesn't take long to just give it a bit of a read through. But things like YouTube descriptions for clips and videos that are put out, it just saves so much time. That's probably where I use it most. I mean, I think Descript sort of has the other AI bits in there that I do like, and the clip creation. Yeah, I'd probably agree. Like usually 3 out of the 5 clips I usually get it to create are actually usable with a bit of tinkering.
Yeah. That's a really good point on the show notes side. I can probably train it a little bit more on how I like to write my description because 'cause I'm very But like I always find some weird analogy that an AI would like never surface. I told like one about the first ever skydiver who skydove from 100 feet from a hot air balloon. And I really forget it was like safety nets. I forget like exactly what the episode was, but it was like a good analogy for the time. Something that's I've found it great for is I always like to give 3 takeaways from the episode in the show notes so that if people don't want to listen, they still get hopefully enough value to maybe join the mailing list.
Yeah.
And I say give me 6 because I assume like half of them are going to be bad.
Right.
And it does a good job at that, right? I'll usually write my own and I'll be like, "Oh, that one, that's a good point. Totally forgot about that," right? Because I'm like trying to actively listen while taking notes, and that's hard. And so, yeah, you're right. I think it is really good for that. And I think the more you train something, what I should probably do is make a custom GPT or whatever. I like say GPT so lazily, like I don't even want to put like effort into it. But I should probably do like a custom one that I train on like my last, I don't know, 16 to 20 episodes. Be like, read the descriptions, internalize how I write these descriptions. Now write a description and see if it's better. Though I have found the longer I use an AI tool, the worse it gets.
Mixed experiences there, and probably other people do as well. To step back from the AI for a moment to the more hands-on approach, there are a lot of people who maybe skip a number of elements of production in their show and just kind of record and throw it out. What's the good and bad of doing that? You just think, well, what I'm going to do is record it, and then it just goes online, and then it's there.
Yeah, here's where that comes from, right? Radio, probably, where you're doing it live, and so you don't have to edit it. The problem with that is that the people on the radio are professionals, and they're good at interviewing.
Yeah,
And you're probably, I hate to break it to you, not as good as they are, right? Not you, John, personally, you people listening.
I'm just a radio
Yeah.
personality.
Right.
I don't know if
I've
I
been
could do that.
Yeah, I did like drama club, and I've been publicly speaking for a long time, and I probably am not as good as the people on the radio either. They probably also get it from professional interviews they see that don't seem like they're edited. Joe Rogan is a good one. Like, I just want to have a raw, unedited conversation. Joe Rogan spends the entire day with his guest.
Right.
Who knows how long they record? Surely it's edited, right? I don't listen to Joe Rogan, so I can't say whether or not it's edited.
Not my favorite either, but yeah.
Yeah, I listen in the car and I have children and he curses a lot. Also, like there are very few 3-hour long podcasts I can listen to.
Yeah.
Or 60 Minutes or a Barbara Walters interview or an Oprah interview. Like they seem like one shots.
Yeah.
But they're probably not. They're edited to tell a story. And so I'll give big it depends energy here because I've been thinking about this a lot. Do you want like raw, real quote unquote content, or do you want something that's polished? And I saw at this conference I was at, my friend Laria Petrucci spoke, and she was asked this about video. When do I do it from my desk with my professional setup, and when do I do it from my iPhone? And she said, and I thought this was so perfect. If you're coming from a place of thought leadership, if you want to be viewed as an authority and an expert, then it should be from your polished setup. And so if you are putting out a podcast for thought leadership where you want people to view you as an expert, as an authority, it needs to be edited. It can't just be like, here's the stuff I'm thinking about today. And no, that's not thought leadership. Right. That's just you thinking out loud.
Yeah. I have no issue with people doing those kinds of podcasts, but I worked with, you probably know Kevin Smidlin from Grow the Show.
Yeah.
So I worked with Kevin for a while.
Way to pronounce his name the right way.
Having worked for the guy, it was a good idea.
I've seen him so many times, and finally at Podcast Moon, I was just like, dude, how do you say your name?
He's a good guy. One of the things that I really learned from doing that, because I was doing sales with Kevin, and so many people out there sort of thinking of professional podcasting or wanting to make some money from podcasting are just want to get together with my mates. We think we're funny. We think we're interesting. We're just going to chew the cud and broadcast it. And good luck. But probably, it's probably very rare that anything would come of that. for most people, because the vast majority, I think, of stuff like that goes out, people
Yeah.
don't want to listen to. But I
Think
couldn't say never, but good luck to them.
think about when you're in a bar or a restaurant or in any public place, how funny your conversation is to you and your friends
Right.
versus how annoying the table next to you sounds.
Right.
Right? And
Yeah.
just remember that if you record a podcast with your friends, just like talk, like yucking it up, you are the other table, right? You're
Mm.
not the table you're sitting at. These people don't know you. They don't care about your inside jokes. 78% of people listen to a podcast to learn something new. And if you don't get to it quick, they're gone because
Yeah.
there is so much content out there.
Yeah. But for the people who are just doing it for fun, have at it.
Yeah,
So
sure.
yeah,
Right.
good luck to you. But
Yeah.
I think
I
I
swing
think
the
most
baseball bat in my backyard. I'm never going to play for the
right.
Yankees.
So most people, I think, do come into podcasting. What do you think? If they're going to produce, if they're going to make and produce a show, they have some thought that they might be able to make some money from it. I mean, do you have any insight on like stats around how many shows actually do make any money, or is that maybe a bit
Mm.
beyond?
Yeah, I think this is so I don't have any. There's Sounds Profitable and Edison Research will have stats on that sort of stuff, maybe
Yeah,
like how many shows are sponsored. And what you'll find is that like millions of dollars is spent every year on podcast sponsorship, but most of it is going to the top 1% of podcasts.
right.
But what is immeasurable, there's nothing tracking this. Maybe even the people who have the podcasts aren't tracking this, is how much money are you making from people who find you via your podcast and then hire you? Or no one's tracking how much money, no outside company is tracking like what individual podcasters are making via affiliate links because they can't possibly have that information.
Sure.
But I put a gift guide episode out every year, and that's just riddled with affiliate links. And I'm really open about it. But those episodes kill. It's me talking for 30 minutes about stuff that you should buy, and people love being told what to buy. And so no one's tracking that. Memberships is trackable if the podcast puts out the numbers. So that's really hard. But it also
Mm,
shows that there are lots of ways to make money from your podcast. I would say it depends on your goals, right? Like the goal is what defines the success. And if you're, like I said earlier, like if your goal is 11 million downloads per episode, like that's a club of
pretty big.
one person,
Yeah.
right? But if your goal is to create good evergreen content that establishes your authority, build your mailing list, and get people into your orbit, I think that is a great goal that it doesn't really matter how many downloads you have. I mean, it does in like a percentage game kind of way,
Mhm.
but you only need a couple hundred downloads to find that one client who might be willing to pay you $5,000 a month or hire you for a $20,000 project.
Yeah. Which can be absolutely probably one of the best ways for most people to think about monetization
Yeah.
when it comes to having a show. Do you think podcasting is at a stage that I maybe think with YouTube it's perhaps a little different, but podcasting, a lot of podcasting is going on through YouTube now. So the landscape is ever changing. I remember when I first got started, I used to listen a lot to Tim Ferriss, and I remember him saying, "Don't start a podcast if you're just thinking about making money, because you won't stick." Which think is generally has been true. But do you think it still will be? Do you think people could sort of more move into the space of thinking, actually, I'm going to come in here and just going to use this channel to make money? I think people perhaps can be more focused on that with YouTube channels, but as the landscape sort of blurs a bit, maybe podcasting could go the same way.
Yeah, I think people will always have that approach, right? Like that approach predates podcasting and YouTube. Oh, I'll just do this and I can make some money, right? That's where
Yeah,
snake oil salesmen come from. I'll just bottle up some oil and say it's a miracle elixir. The rub, though, is that yeah, you could start a YouTube channel or a podcast and maybe make money if people want to listen to it.
sure.
That's the really important part. That's true of YouTube videos too, or YouTube channels, right?
Yeah,
Like, people see Mr. Beast and MKBHD and a handful of other people, and they're like, "Man, they're killing it on YouTube. Like, how can I do that?" Because they started just by making good content, right? And putting a lot of time into effort into creating something that lots of people want.
Yeah.
And by that measure, if you think you're just gonna come and talk for 30 minutes about something or yuck it up with your friend and just put it out there, no, that mentality will not work. But if you come in and say, "Hey, I wanna make a really good show," then yeah, I think you have an honest shot at making money some way.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I do think prob probably just being realistic, most people are not prepared to put in the amount of energy that would need to go into making something of good quality. For me, my own journey has been one of, like yourself, iteration after iteration and figuring things out. Definitely much more sort of figure it out as I go along. Looking back, I don't know if it was the best way to go about doing it. And I've often said I would probably, if I could go back and do it again, I would probably start as a guest rather than a host.
Mhm.
Podcast guesting is clearly very useful. I mean, you're being a guest, you're my guest here today. What sort of thoughts or input do you have on the value of podcast guesting and your own experience with that and what you maybe would recommend for other people there as well?
Ooh, great question, right? Because I suspect a lot of people listening are speakers, probably authors.
Yeah,
They wanna do guesting more than have their own show. I think. So, first, you need to think about, again, like, whatever you do, you want it to be worth listening to. And when you pitch a podcast, don't just be like, "Hey, John, I'm so great. I have 4 patents and I have a book coming out. Do you wanna interview me?" No. My pitch to you, I suspect, was around, like, how I can help you teach your audience how to save time or be a better podcaster. Like, I
yeah,
always I look at the description of the show and who the audience is, and then I craft a pitch around that, right? This is when I was talking earlier about something that I could outsource but choose not to. This is it. Because my
yeah,
VA would just send the same email to every podcaster. And I don't want to do that. I want to be like, "Hey, I didn't just randomly find your podcast and send you a generic pitch. I actually looked into your podcast to see if it's worth my time and yours." And so that's the first thing. Know a little bit about the podcast and put what you can do for their audience above everything else. You can tell them about yourself in the third paragraph. In the first paragraph, tell them about what you're going to do for their audience. And then, as far as making the most out of it, pitch a topic that you are an expert in and prepared to talk about, right? Like, I've had someone like, "Hey, do you want to come on my podcast and talk about building community?" And I could have just been like, "Yeah," but I was like, "I don't know how to build. I'm not good at that part. I'm not an expert in that part, certainly." And they're like, "Well, you built a podcast. Isn't that like a community?" I'm like, "No, that's really more like the microphone in the school office over the speaker, right? Where I can't hear what the students are saying."
right.
But, and that would have been a waste of my time and a waste of the podcast host time and the audience time, because it's not something that I could speak intelligently to. And so make sure you pitch a topic you know what you're talking about, and then have a clear call to action. What I like to do, I don't want to spoil this, but what I like to do is have a URL, usually with the host's name. I've been on enough shows that I find it statistically impossible that I haven't had the same name of a podcast host, but that remains the truth. So people will be able to go to whatever URL I say at the end. I don't want to make it about this slash John to get something, right? Probably join my mailing list, but also learn more about me and where they can find me. If you have a podcast, mention the podcast. I think like those three things, like how to pitch well, make it about the audience, pitch a topic that you know really well, and be picky about the shows that you go on. Don't just go on every show. Go on the shows that'll be the place where you can make the highest impact. And 3, have a clear call to action so that when you deliver on that performance, when you make that impact, listeners know where to find you.
Other than making sure that you have your stuff ready to go, are there any things that you have learned to make sure that you do when you're guesting that maybe you picked up as just sort of, all right, it's good to do this, so it's good to, these are the kind of best practices that you've been able to create there, your systems guys. What are your systems when other than the pitching stuff when it comes to guesting?
Yeah, great question. So I want to make sure that I have listened to at least part of an episode. Like you and I had a pre-show call, so
We did.
or a pre-interview. I felt pretty confident about who your audience is and what we're talking about. But I always want to feel that way. I don't want to just come in blind, be like a substitute teacher that just puts a movie on because they don't know where the teacher is, like the main
Yeah.
teacher is, right? I want to add to the conversation. And so I do have a Notion database of all the episodes where I podcast guests, and I try to keep track of that. So here's who I pitched, here's who I'm going on. I've created that special link for them, right? Because I want to make sure I do that before the show goes live because I don't want to immediately not deliver on some promise I've made. I also have the free resource because I have a couple of free resources and mentioned one based on what we've talked about. And then I have when the episode goes live and if I have promoted it because I know as a podcaster, like we really love when our guests promote our episodes to their audience. As a podcast host, I try to get the guest to talk about something they don't normally talk about so that it's easier, right? Because if it's just, oh yeah, here's like the fifth podcast where I talked about chapter 5 of my book, it's not like my audience isn't going to care, so I'm not going to promote
Mm.
that. But I do like to at least repost or retweet or whatever it's called these days, right? I like to share the the host's post at least with my audience. And then I'll usually do a roundup like once a month of, hey, I went on a bunch of shows this month. Here's where to check them out. And so I will have a column for if I've shared it already.
That's cool. I generally have found that I don't have the expectation that necessarily people will share the show. I really just try and tag people. So let's make sure we're connected. I mostly push the show out on LinkedIn and YouTube. So usually it's going to be LinkedIn. If we're connected there, which I think we are, then I can just tag and it's like, okay, it's nice and easy then. Is so people can come and comment on the post which they're in. They can repost them. I think I've found that that's one of the things that makes it easiest. Are there any other ways that you maybe personally use for that if you have guests yourself on your show or for the promotion for the way you promote things?
I will just add that like that is even better for you, right? Because then when people interact with it, it shows the post to more people.
Yeah.
Um, so no, I don't have the expectation that my guests are going to share either. I know some hosts are like, you will share this show. And I'm like, I'll do whatever I want. I'm like a free person. I never, ever dictate what my guest has to do. They've given me their time,
Right.
and that's all
Exactly.
I can ask for. I email them and I say, it's an automated email, a little WordPress plugin I wrote. So, like, when the episode goes live, it's like, hey, Name, thanks so much for coming on the show. You can find it here. I would love and appreciate if you shared it. That's it. That's it. But I'm like even bad at posting it on social media too. Like I'm like real like my ground game for promoting my show is really let it go live, post it in places, mention it on my newsletter or
Yeah.
whatever.
I'm trying
But
to get more consistent with that myself. It's not
yeah,
easy. Need to
I've
follow some
had
of your systems.
shout out to a few of my guests. They've asked for the raw video and then they've created clips from it and have shared it
Okay.
and tagged
Cool.
me. And
Yeah,
I'm
that's
like,
good.
yeah, you're better at sharing my podcast than I am at sharing my podcast.
Yeah, I've had that as well.
Yeah.
I've been put to shame by some of my guests in the past.
Yeah.
But it's always good to see how it should be done or how it could be done, and
Yeah.
we can learn and grow from that.
I should say I'm like coming off like I don't promote my podcast. I spend a lot of time on the SEO aspect of it. I put a lot of effort into my podcast website, and it's one of the reasons that my show got big the way it did early on. And so I put a lot of thought into the titles and the descriptions so that they show up in Google. And if you Google certain people, this is like a moving target, but if you Google certain people, my show is the first thing to show up for them. For a while, my friend Kat Mulvihill was one of those people. When I Googled her, my podcast interview with her was one of the first. She's gotten bigger since since that episode came out. But for a while, first page of Google, if you Googled her name, was my show. I do spend a lot of time there because I want my show to be found via Google because there's really no YouTube for podcasting as far as like an app that recommends new episodes.
Yeah.
And so optimizing it for search is the way to get your show found organically.
Is that something that you help your clients with as well?
Yeah, we do talk through that. I do mostly focus on the like system side of things, but if I'm helping podcasters, inevitably they'll be like, I want to grow and I want to make money. And so one of the things that we work through is sometimes I'll do a growth audit for people where I look at like these 10 aspects of your show. What's the name of your show? What's the description of your show? What's the name of your episode? No one cares if the episode is episode 135 with Emily Aborn. No, that tells me nothing. Emily is the guest of my show that came out this week. You wanna give people a reason to click, and so, like, that episode, which is actually 4 something, um, is 4 ways to market without social media with Emily Aborn, right? Oh, 4 ways to market without social media. Like, I hate social media. I thought I needed it to market, but this is telling me I don't? Tell me more.
Yeah, my co-host on my other show is going to want to check that out. She hates social media for sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
that
me
sounds really
too.
good.
That's why I had her on the show.
And this is the Streamlined Entrepreneur show, yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
over at streamline.fm or Streamline Solopreneur, wherever you get your podcasts.
Streamlined Solopreneur. Go and check it out. This has been so much high value for people, and I know that any of my listeners who are in podcasting in some way, shape, or form, or thinking about it, are going to love this. So thank you so much, Joe, for sharing this. You did mention that you've made it nice and easy and streamlined for people to be able to find out more about you as well and get some value, some additional value from having listened to this today. What's the link for people to go and find that out?
Yeah, so if you go over to podcastworkflows.com/John, you will get access to my automations database. It's got over 40 automations in it. And what I would encourage you to do is look at that for ideas. Don't necessarily feel like you need to implement all of those things. It's really you can if you want to, because the templates are there, but it'll really give you a good idea of what's possible in your business. And there will also be links to social media and my podcast there as well. But yeah, my free automations database is the real value of going to that page.
I'm gonna go and check that out myself. I think I need to take a good look. It's been a real treat speaking to you. You show so much value. You're doing wonderful work, helping make people's lives easier, and making the podcast production process easier for people as well. So thank you for sharing your wisdom and insights with us today. I'll look forward to staying connected with you and continuing to learn from you in the future from your show and your mailing list as well. But Joe Casabona, thank you for coming on Present Influence.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.